Bad times make strong men. Strong men make good times. Good times make weak men, and weak men make bad times. It's an old adage. It actually goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy with an idea called Anacyclosis. We call it the cycle of regimes. I'm Chad Garrett, and this is the Chad Garrett Show. Our world is primed for a shift. In what direction that shift goes and what that shift will look like is anyone's guess. My theories are based on anacyclosis. And just like history has this tendency to rhyme with itself, it doesn't really repeat itself, it more rhymes. And since it rhymes, I think that if we analyze the rhythmic pattern of history, we can somehow guess maybe where it's going to go in the future. Anacyclosis is one such pattern, and we're going to break down what this cycle is. In Greek, it literally breaks down to the rule of one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. As survival has become easier, the cycle has really come into its own. Before the domestication of animals and people beginning to gather in cities, you didn't really see this cycle existing because forms of government weren't as important to survival. And what helped these different cultures survive was who was leading them. Whoever could lead them to the food, whoever was the strongest at being able to help the tribe with survival, that's who they put in the head. But it doesn't quite work out that way anymore. Once people began to domesticate, the true struggle for power began. The power ladder was formed. Now, whether it was because people domesticated and came together from different places in the world and there was just intense chaos in the cities and they needed someone to lead them, or whether it was because of the natural appointment of the tribal leader to the monarchy position, the monarchy comes in to being. This is rule by the one. And it begins our cycle. And to any critically thinking individual, you can understand why the monarchy is such an effective form of government. We have a bad taste in our mouths about it, but we'll talk about that in a second. I actually want to highlight some of the perks of why the monarchy is actually, in my opinion, the most effective form of government. It's why we mimic the monarchy in our hierarchy of powers in the military, our chain of command. It's because as far as being effective in decision-making and leading a people down a visionary path, it's hard to get better than a monarchy where it's one man's vision and one man's decision. Now, this seems like it's unfair. It seems like it's too much power for one person. Okay, maybe. I would argue that it's not as divisive as you might think. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of divisive. I think it's unifying. I think it's extremely unifying. When you look back at some of the greatest monarchies, and we will here in just a second, when you look back at some of the greatest monarchs that have taken the crown, that have wore the mantle, you realize that they are often the golden boy of their civilization. They're the champion of the people. The symbol of what everyone in that society should strive to be. People like Alexander the Great. Let's break down who Alexander the Great was first. First of all, he was a Macedonian, right? And in the terms of Greece, where we think of Athens and Sparta and the city-states being these great places, Thebes, the city of Thebes being this phenomenal place of culture, and Sparta being this wonderful place of warrior culture, right? No one really talks about the Greek-speaking Macedonians that are up in the hills. In the northern part of Greece, they're kind of like the West Virginia Hicks of the Greek culture. Until Alexander's father, Philip, comes along and says, nope, we're going to make a name for ourselves. As a matter of fact, Philip spends just about every coin in the Macedonian kingdom's coffers building up this massive military. He also spends some of that money getting Alexander the Great, and I have to say this, he gets Alexander the Great, probably the coolest tutor other than Jesus Christ, like ever, right? He hits him like one of the dopest people to like instruct him on philosophy and on logic and on anything that was considered academia of the time. Alexander the Great's tutor was like the guy, right? It was Aristotle, right? So you have Alexander the Great, who Philip hires Aristotle to come and be his personal tutor. Talk about setting somebody up for success. Like, that is so cool. And it shows in Alexander's ability to lead. It shows in his military prowess and his ability to logic through things. It shows in his compassion towards his people and understanding the philosophical implications of what he did and how that impacts the people that are following him's mind. He was loved by the soldiers that followed him, and he was also quite cocky. I'm going to dig on myself a little bit here. I think that's why I resonate with him a little bit, is just the amount of confidence that exudes off of this guy is wonderful. When you have the guts and the gall and the sheer just virtuoso chest, like to say that you are a direct descendant of Achilles, like, okay, like you might have something going for you there. What's worse is that he didn't just say it, he backed it up. He was on the front lines for most of the fights that he went into with his men. His men loved him so much that there are stories of him fighting and doing great work in these battles and not being any slouch at all in these fights, and how his men would put themselves in harm's way to save him. There's a story when they were conquering Greece, and they traversed over the same area that Xerxes traversed over as he was marching on Thermopylae, and how Alexander decimated one individual, and another soldier came up and was about to cleave into his helmet. The first guy cleaved into his helmet and took his helmet off, and Alexander killed that guy and didn't see the second guy. And the second guy comes in and he's aiming at his bare head now because he doesn't have a helmet on anymore. And one of Alexander's fellows saves him. He expands the territories of the Macedonian Empire into one of the largest land empires that had been seen at that particular point in history, into much of Persia, what was at that point Persia, conquering much of Persia, and he would have kept going. He had plans to keep going and to conquer all of what Persia had into Asia Minor. And he didn't do it because he had compassion and he listened to those that were advising him, and he also became ill. When he left his home of Macedonia, he was so set on his conquest of the world that he knew he would never return, and he never did. Let's talk about someone else for a second then. Let's talk about Augustus Caesar. Now, Augustus Caesar was the second emperor of Rome, technically, depending on how you look at it. If Julius Caesar was the first emperor, he never actually claimed the title of emperor. He claimed the title of dictator for life. It was something along the lines of dictator in perpetuity, right? Until he was dead. It was the title that Julius Caesar held, and upon his death by members of the Senate and some of his allies, he posthumously announced that his heir would be Gaius Octavius, who took the name of Gaius Octavius Caesar and eventually became known as Augustus Caesar, one of the longest reigning emperors of Rome, and also the direct cause of the decimation of the fabled Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium with the help of his naval admiral Agrippa in the south, cutting off the supply lines. Augustus Caesar wasn't just able to take what Julius Caesar did and run with it. Julius Caesar was assassinated by people that didn't want to give up their senatorial power to him. And yet Augustus Caesar, in the aftermath, got the Senate to essentially vote away their power. He got them to just give it up after they killed a man for it. He was able to continue a unified vision of Rome that Julius Caesar had and expanded the territories. Augustus Caesar is mainly known for ruling during the period known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. A peaceful emperor. I want to talk about another one that's a little bit, might be a little bit controversial for those that fall on the Christian side of things, because there was a great ruler in the Muslim world too. Saladin, Amir Saladin. He was a 12th century king of the Islamic caliphates and one of the first Islamic kings to conquer Jerusalem. Now, from a Christian and a Jewish perspective, this leaves a little bit of a bad taste in our mouth. It's the Holy Land, right? It's a place that they went into and they decimated the temple on the mountain. There's still all of this strife around the city of Jerusalem now, the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock that was built on it. But Saladin was known for being extremely compassionate, even towards those that he considered to be infidels. Now, he was a conqueror and a brilliant strategist, but he was not unkind, and he was extremely wise, and he earns his place amongst the great monarchs of our society and our history. Before I jump into the ideas of why monarchs leave a bad taste in our mouth, I want to take a second to thank all of you for listening and watching. If you're watching this and you're engaging with my weird facial expressions and like dodging around behind the mic, and me every now and then glancing over at Chase, who keeps me entertained while I do this. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, right? We want your continued support for this. So if you're enjoying this, if you're enjoying the content in any way, shape, or form, please do us a favor. Like the video, subscribe to the page on wherever you're at, whether you're on Spotify, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Apple iTunes. Subscribe, and leave us a 5-star review wherever you possibly can, okay? Whether that's Apple iTunes, whether that's on our Facebook page, which is Forerunner Productions, whether that's my Facebook page, Chad W. Garrett. I don't care where you leave us a review at. Leave us a 5-star review. It's immensely helpful. And the last thing that you can do before I start asking you for money is to share all of the content on your page. But if you do want to support us financially, please check us out at patreon.com/Forerunner. That's patreon.com/Forerunner. There's all sorts of extra content, everything from articles for you guys to read from our content creator, Bergen, and to early access to published works by myself and our editor-in-chief, Brianna Merritt, as well as EPs coming out from the audio guru, Chase Sizemore, as well as bloopers and so many other things. Anything that we can think of to give you guys extra access and a view into our lives and a view into some of the cool things that we do behind the scenes, including like my political views besides just an analysis of anacyclosis. You can get all of that on our Patreon page, so go check that out. Okay, Why do people remember monarchs most? Because it's extremely prone to corruption. Why we have a bad taste in our mouth about monarchies is because it leaves a really bad taste in our mouth whenever we see these supposedly great men that are supposed to lead our society, these champions, these golden boys of our society, when we see them fall to corruption. I got a few examples of that too. One of them, we're going to stick with the Roman era here. We're going to talk about Caligula, right? So after Augustus, there was a emperor named Tiberius, and Tiberius's grandson was named Caligula. Now, Caligula was into all sorts of weird crap, everything from incest with his sisters to laying the foundations for the Senate orgies that were ended up happening during the times of Nero, which is one of his descendants. Caligula was weird, man. Like there's no two ways about it. Caligula was really weird, and he was extremely cruel. And he pushed down the plebeian class very hard. And after a 4-year reign, only 4 years, right? So Augustus Caesar and the Pax Romana went almost 40 years. And Caligula only ruled for 4. And then he was assassinated, and rightfully so. But even more than Caligula, if you thought that 4 years was a short reign, it's like the time that somebody spends in the presidency, right? Imagine just being emperor, like someone's being the president, and like that's it. Let me shorten it up for you. How about Maximilien Robespierre, right? I'm so proud that I can roll my R's like that. Maximilien Robespierre, a French tyrant in every sense of the word. He was only officially in power for 1 year. But in that 1 year, he was known as the Reign of Terror because he was able to cause the death of somewhere between 16 and 40,000 deaths of the French people that he was supposed to be leading. Eventually, a conspiracy of French nobles overthrew him and had him executed for his heinous crimes against the people. Not soon enough. Not soon enough. When the monarchy gets corrupted, whether it's through hubris or greed or arrogance or apathy, right? So let me go through each one of those. Hubris, getting too big for your britches, right? And kind of goes along with greed, right? So hubris and ambition, thinking that you're more than what you are. And then greed, wanting more than what you should probably have. It's arguable that Alexander the Great experienced quite a bit of greed himself, but he knew how to keep his greed in check. That's why he stopped when he did. There are some tyrants that just don't know when to stop. There are some tyrants that get very arrogant about their rule. I think that Robespierre is a pretty good model of that. King George, right? The one in 1776 that Continental Congress declared their independence from, was an arrogant individual. Or whether it's from apathy. Strong men make good times. Good times make weak men. Apathy, the weak amongst us because of the good times. They forget the struggles and the things that were necessary to make the society great. Through any one of these things, we see the emergence and the corruption of the monarchy into the tyrannical. And when the tyrant is identified, because oftentimes the tyrants, they can play it off for a little while, right? Incognito. Oh no, I'm still a good altruistic monarch, or I'm still a good monarch. I'm doing this, I'm making the best for the people, right? No. When they're finally identified, the result is that a few good men rise to the occasion and they unseat the tyrant. When the tyrant is unseated, they don't just reinstitute a new monarchy, though, because oftentimes the tyrannical rule leaves a bad taste in our mouths. It leaves us scarred and scared. And thus is the emergence of the aristocracy, the rule by the few. There are some major perks to the aristocracy that make it a more representative part of government than what we would consider a monarchy to be. It's harder to corrupt more men, right? It's easy to corrupt one man. It's harder to corrupt 50 or 100 men, right? It's 100 different pieces of virtue that you have to get through. It provides a larger representation of the people. These men come from different backgrounds oftentimes, even in the Roman Senate. These people come from different backgrounds, and they'll come from different places of the world, and they'll understand the different needs that come from the different places in the kingdom. And so they'll be able to make laws and pass legislation based on the needs of the people, at least more accurately. And it provides checks and balances against one another. There's a very personal aspect to a aristocracy, right? Our Congress is a form of aristocracy. Looking at it from afar and just seeing the names of people sitting in seats and the decisions that are made by the collective, it is very easy to forget the personal relationships that are held between these members of the Senate, of the Congress, the House, whatever. Checks and balances amongst friends, not just amongst powers. The decision making is slower, though. It keeps you from being able to make the split-second decisions that are necessary, often in a time of war. It is why, when the formation of the United States, the president has special powers in times of war to make split decisions that he otherwise would otherwise be considered outside of the bounds of his power. It would be considered an abuse of his power that he could potentially get impeached for. It is a perk that the monarchy has. It's a perk that our founding fathers recognized. But it's not something that we want to have in effect all the time, because brash decision-making can often lead to horrible decisions that have lasting impacts on our society. But eventually, through the slow decision-making and the coveting of power by the large families, the head families, the powerful families that make up the aristocracy, you get the corruption into just as lethal and tyrannical a rule as the monarchy has, and this we call the oligarchy. Roman culture has another phenomenal example of this, and it's in the Gracchian period. After the Punic Wars with Carthage, when Rome figures out that they can actually become a world power, they institute the Senate. The Senate becomes an oligarchy. They begin to ignore, they allow the aristocracy to ignore certain laws that were put into place to allow the Roman citizenry to have plentiful land and plentiful work, to the point where the plebeian class stops having kids because they don't have enough money or land to raise their families on. They begin to get very depressed about their society. And when the aristocracy becomes an oligarchy, you see the people rise up. In Rome, the people rose up by taking, oddly enough, aristocrats and electing them to high-level positions. These two men are Gaius Gracchus and Tiberius Gracchus, two brothers separated by 10 years and two very different personalities. Gaius starts the path, and Tiberius follows up with it, and the Gracchian period is considered by many to be the beginning of the end of the Roman Senate. And so when the people rise up, when they begin to fight back and they finally win after often a very bloody conflict with the aristocracy, you get democracy, the rule of the many. The perfect form of government, right? But what if I told you that democracy as the perfect and best form of government is a lie? If you want to know why, you'll have to catch me next week. I'm Chad Garrett, and this is The Chad Garrett Show.